We have a YouTube channel at church.
If I can have everybody's attention quickly, please, for just 1 moment. Thank you all for coming back to round 2 of Orthodox and Fasting Ryan. I hope you found everything here okay, and our food and the environment. Father Anthony is our first speaker. For those of you who know him, you may already know his story. For those of you who don't, Father Anthony's excuse me.
I'm sorry.
Convert to Orthodoxy. He's the present pastor of St. Michael's Mediterranean Orthodox Church in Woonsocket, which had the fire last year, and is undergoing some renovations, I understand, and is working towards a resolution. He also has a military background, military intelligence specifically. And today's going to talk about, I think, conversion generally and his story, what he saw, what he experienced, and how it led him to Orthodoxy in the long term. So without any further ado,
Appreciate it. Yeah, so when you look at my resume, it's got a lot of different stuff on it, right? Right now I'm a pastor at St. Michael's, right? And I also have been an adjunct professor at the Naval War College and at our seminary in New Jersey. Let's see what else. I'm on the Metropolitan Council and all these other things. But there's really only one thing. If you want to figure me out, you really only need to know one thing, right? And that's what I've given my life for. And that's Christ and the Holy Church. I'm going to give you a little bit, just a kind of dry background outline of where I'm coming from. And then maybe I'll start talking about some things I learned from the Army that helped lead me deeper into Orthodoxy. And I really want to hear your questions, right? So, be thinking those, interrupt me at any time you want. I'm fine with that. So I was born in Georgia. Georgia, right. I was born at Fort Benning, Georgia. I went to school at the University of Georgia. Got married in Georgia to a Southern girl. So, you can judge my commitment to Christ based on the fact that a Southerner is willing to move to Rhode Island and honestly and serve a parish that's Ukrainian Orthodox, right? These are not the things that when I was young I would have chosen, right? It makes sense now, it works, right? But where am I most at home? Is it in New England? No, it's not. I'm not really comfortable here. And, you know, I love the Ukrainian people, I love the Ukrainian church, it's my new home. But do I still love Southern culture more? Yeah. Yeah, I do. And as much as I love Federhi, I love barbecue more. And you can't find boiled peanuts up here. So, that's where I'm coming from. And in the South, I can't assume that you know this. There was a recent study in Georgia, and I think we talked a little bit about it online, right? Where they found out that Providence is the least biblical city in the country, right? Least biblical. And it's
Bible-minded, I think.
Bible-minded. And it's a little bit rigged, right? Because the questions that they focused on were, do you believe that the Bible is accurate? Well, what does that mean, right? That can be code for are you an evangelical? Okay, but the other question was, do you read the Bible every day? Okay. Where do you think the cities that were most biblical are? In the South, right. And as a result, and Missouri, you don't count that as the South, right? So it's a very different environment. Like when I'm with my family in the South, our family reunions and stuff, it's nothing for us to talk about our walk with Jesus, right? That's just part of what you do, right? Here, even among families, I don't see it being that comfortable. Of course, we're going to pray together, we're going to hold hands at every meal, guess so. Okay. So I want you to understand that it was this commitment to Christ that I grew up with that led me into Orthodoxy and then into the priesthood, right? So for me, it was a very natural progression. What did that look like, kind of in basic outline? Let me give you 3 resumes. Okay, the first is my academic resume. I went to the University of Georgia, studied political science, studied Russian literature. Went to graduate school at Ohio State, studied political science. Was working on my PhD when I had to leave my studies after 9/11. I was ABD. And then now I have a Master's of Divinity, and so on.
What's ABD?
All but dissertation. This is, where you defended your prospectus, you published some papers, but you haven't defended your dissertation. So it means that basically you have a master's degree. Is that right? I have a real PhD right here. My military one, since this is the way we advertise it, my military resume looks like this. I joined in 1987. It was still the Cold War. I hated communism. Right? Remember that whole Bible thing? All right. I hated communism. And they taught me Russian. So for a year, I studied Russian in Monterey, California. And then I went to several months of interrogator school. That was my first job. And then I went to airborne school, and I was an interrogator in a unit out of Fort Bragg. So then later on, when I went to Ohio to graduate school, I joined a research unit. And in 9/11, that research unit was mobilized to do full-time intel support to the intelligence community. And then I ended up staying there for several years. All right. And then the third one is kind of my spiritual resume, right? And so the question, if you're in the South, is when did you get saved, right? Well, I grew up in the church. But within the Methodist Church, which is how I grew up, you didn't talk necessarily about being saved so much. When did God touch your heart? When did you have that warming of the heart? Is that I'm looking at Father Kevin because he also grew up Methodist, right? And I had a definite experience, and I didn't know what to do about it. And so I talked to my mother. My mother did the sensible thing and sent me to the preacher. And the preacher that Sunday, we talked about it for hours. And so that Sunday, do you know what that preacher did? I was like 14, 15 years old. He announced to the whole congregation, Doug's been called by God, he's going to be a preacher. Thank you very much. It took me another 25 years to get around to it. I was very happy as a Methodist. Methodist Church, they teach you the love of God, the sinfulness of man, and salvation through Christ. Focusing on the love of God, right? And it also has a very strong musical tradition. I'm a musician. Very good place for me to be. When we moved to Ohio, though, it's probably, with Providence in terms of the least biblical cities, Columbus, Ohio. And we began to notice some things going on in that church. Like I went to a Bible study that was led by a seminarian. And in the Methodist Church, they say the Apostles' Creed every week, which is similar to the Nicene Creed. It's just not as consistent. But you profess faith in, Trinity, virgin birth, salvation through Christ, that kind of thing. This seminarian, he said, that thing about the virgin birth, theologians just came up with that to protect the divinity of Christ. Okay, he's a seminarian. He didn't make this up. He was taught that. So I recognized that this was a church that was straying from biblical principles, from the truth that I had professed every day and that I knew deep down in my bones to be correct. And so I couldn't stay. And I'm the kind of guy that when something breaks, I don't just replace it. I always research and try to get something even better. right? So when the coffee maker breaks, you get a French press. Okay? When my phone broke, I got a, note, a Galaxy Note, thinking back. So I started doing research and just really fell in love with the church fathers. I never heard of them before. It's a common tradition. All Christians share it, but it's not really taught. You don't have classes on it. You're not encouraged to read them. And then when the biggest gift that I got early on from the Orthodox Church was a prayer book. So in '96, how you doing? A friend gave me a prayer book, introduced me to the church fathers, and then I went to Russia to do research for my dissertation. And visited every church I could find, right? Iconography and all that kind of stuff. And that was really the beginning of my catechumen period, 1996. It took me until 2000 to convert. So 4 years of discernment. During that time, remember I was an interrogator, right? I had a priest who was willing to meet with me once a week. And I could ask him whatever I wanted. An Orthodox Priest. No, this was here. This was Ohio State. And I had a colleague in the Department of Political Science who had recently converted. And he and his godfather, we exchanged over 1,000 papers. We went more by every point of Orthodox theology. And I said, why do you do this? Why do you do this? Why this and not that? Right? Held everything up for scrutiny. This is what it's like to be a convert. You want to know why converts, seem to know so much? That's why. They're not going to buy into something unless they can trust it. And at some point, there were still some things that I was like, you know what? I don't know. But at that point, there was that trust that kicked in. That knowledge that this was, the church. And the way that happened, my first conversion was intellectual. I told you I fell in love with the church fathers, the councils, all that stuff. But the conversion of the heart happened liturgically. Once I began to worship every week as an Orthodox Christian worships. And once you do that, you really can't go back and be satisfied. Because Orthodox worship is so different than what you get anywhere else. So, did we have good music in the Methodist church? Yes. Was it easier to sing along with? Yes. It was. It had scansion, it had rhyme, it had all these things that you expect to come with music. None of this is present in the Orthodox liturgy. None of it. It doesn't rhyme, it doesn't have a fixed scansion. But it's beautiful. It is so beautiful. When you walk into an Orthodox church, and for me, it was like, yes, if all these things I profess are true, this is the way I would expect us to act, just like these people are acting. And to be honest with you, and I don't know, she never listens to my podcast. My wife probably won't watch this video. But one of the reasons we waited is because we had to make sure it was right for her too. There was no way that I was going to convert without my wife. No way. And so on Pascha of 2000, we converted. We converted in a mission parish that we helped to establish in That was in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio. And it was a year later that here I was, still new in the faith, just loving every moment of it. That the attack on 9/11 came. Right? And I knew because of what I did and the clearances that I had in my background that I wasn't going to be staying in Columbus. And the call came a month later and we were mobilized. We knew it was going to be for at least 1 year, probably 2 years. Right? And at that time, we had just bought into the American dream. Ohio State, even though I didn't have a PhD, they created a staff position where I could do everything I wanted to do. If I came up with a list, I want a job that does this, and by the way, don't make me stand for tenure. It was there. I got to teach whenever I wanted. And I got to do research that was supported by the community. We bought a nice house. Didn't have a picket fence yet, but I was working on it, right? Had one child, you know. My wife had a good job. Finally found a church we loved. It was over. 9/11. And so for the first year, we kept our family at home in Columbus, and they would try to come out to Virginia, where I was stationed, once a month. And then after a year of that, we were just like, this is silly, you know, just sell the house, we'll move to Virginia. And what made it easy to do was the way that the parish in Virginia adopted us. I showed up, and I knew I had a choice. Soldiers are notorious, right? They're not notorious for going to church. Soldiers and mobilized reservists are the same way. There are all kinds of temptations when you're away from your family. Right? We were going to be away from our families for a year. Now here I was on fire. I love this Orthodox church, and now I'm away from it. And we were doing really important work for the intelligence community. But you can only work, 12, 14 hours a day. And then they send you home. What was I going to do with the rest of my time? My family bought me a PlayStation. That wasn't enough. The first thing I did when I got there was I looked through the yellow pages and I found a church. I was familiar with the OCA. Okay? There was also a Greek church list, and there was a Ukrainian church. I knew the OCA would be in. So I called that priest. And he turned out to be a wonderful priest, and we got to be close. But we had a 30-second conversation, and I started out by saying, hello, this is Doug Perkins. I've been mobilized to Charlottesville for a year or two. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm looking for a home. You know what he told me in that 30 seconds? So you always have an elevator speech, right? His was this. We are a traditional Orthodox parish. All of our women cover their heads and wear skirts because we believe that's the way it should be. Okay. I didn't have an opinion on headscarves and skirts. The parish we were coming from, that was true. But what I expect to hear from a priest is something pastoral. Something that recognizes the challenges that I'm going through as a soldier away from his family. And unfortunately, it just didn't do that. And so I was still going to give you a chance. I went to Vespers, and there was a note on the door that said, we are not here because our bishop is in Richmond. Sorry. So I said, well, I guess I'll see what the Ukrainian church is doing. And to be honest, I never considered Greek. Forgive me. I didn't. The Greek parish in Columbus was huge. You're probably familiar with it. It's beautiful. But they were not known for being welcoming. And so, unfortunately, I didn't give them a chance. But when I showed up for Vespers in that Ukrainian church, they did exactly what I needed. They brought me into the kleros, let me sing. The priest, heard my confession then, and just from then on, it was just like family. And within 4 months, I was meeting the bishop. And he said, you've been called to the priesthood. We're going to come up with a plan for you. I said, I'm a soldier. I said, we'll work it out. So I started the St. Stephen's program the next year, and concurrently with our program at St. Stephen's. And so I was ordained as a sub-deacon a year later, a deacon 2 or 3 years later, and a priest 3 years after that. So that's the basic outline of my story. During that time, I made 2 trips to Afghanistan. I traveled all over the world, literally, all the way out to Japan, Afghanistan, of course, Qatar, Russia, Romania. I traveled a lot. And what finally was the kick in the tail to get me into the priesthood, because I would have been happy as a deacon forever. Deacon's got the ideal job. I had a good job working for the Army. You know, I was doing analysis, I was a political scientist, doing the job. And my second mobilization to Afghanistan was just a nightmare. Things were not going well there, of course. My wife was pregnant. And it was horrific. It was the hardest 4 months of my life. And on the way back, I got the call that you never want. And sorry, I'm getting a little bit personal. But when I was in Uzbekistan, you know, one of the states, on my way back, they said the Red Cross was you never want that, because that means there's a medical emergency in your family. And final team I had lost a child. And so I swore, this is never going to happen again. I'm never going to be away from home with my wife. And when we got back, my bishop called and said, I think it's time. I said, yeah, I think you're right. And it was so funny when we got to Attleboro to talk to our bishop. I'm very close to my bishop. It's a real blessing. He is my pastor. And my priest and I had come up with this plan. Right? I was going to take over in Charlottesville. He was going to be the second priest. He was going to give all of his talks on stewardship that he was really into. All worked out. It was perfect. So my wife and I sat down there with our Vladika, with our bishop, and we said, Vladika, we got it. And he said, stop, I don't want to hear it. I've got the perfect place for you. Woonsocket, Rhode Island. And then he got up and he left the room, right? And my wife and I, we look at each other, we're like, Rhode Island? We're like, yeah, I think it's north of New York. Because for a southerner, you know, that's just, there be dragons. You know, once you get up to New York. So we assume it's all just a suburb. You know, it's all New York City. And he said, no, this is going to be a very good fit for you. And it has been. It's been tremendous. There's been no better blessing in my life. But again, it's not the kind of plan you come up with. When you give your life to Christ and just open yourself up to whatever it is He's calling you to do, you don't know, you cede control, but you're guaranteed joy. You're guaranteed content. And that's what we've done. Marriage has never been stronger. You know, my wife and I are so happy to be here, despite the fact that it's new. No, I mean, honestly, look outside. So that's the basics of the story. Now let me throw out some things that I learned in the Army that really, I think, helped me be an Orthodox Christian and helped me be a more effective priest to the extent I'm effective at all. There are three things that I think that the Army created the space for Orthodoxy to be. One of them is duty, right? And I got that from my family. My family's, that's the way we're wired, right? And when you have that kind of sense of duty, the willingness to die for something abstract, right? And that's reinforced. I think you have a better understanding of love. Because in my book, when I read about what love, true love requires, it's a whole lot more like duty than it is like the kind of sap that Hollywood and Madison Avenue are selling. Right? And it's not as, it doesn't sound as romantic, but it is. What's more romantic than somebody who's willing to give up everything even when his heart isn't in it? Even when his feelings aren't there? There's nothing greater than that. Nothing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the system. And what I mean, I don't mean like the system, right, the matrix. What I mean is trusting the system. When the Army gets somebody, they can take somebody who's completely raw, who has no skills, nothing. And through basic training, they can graduate someone who is not just proficient with the rifle, but can shoot under stress accurately, can take apart that weapon and put it back together. Most of these guys, they've never even seen a rifle before they got the basic training. They learn how to, deal with all kinds of stress, all kinds of new skills, first aid. You can't even imagine the kinds of things that they fit into that AV because they have a system. Have y'all read The Gates of Fire? Well, most of y'all are Greek, right? You read The Gates of Fire? No? Thermopylae. You're familiar, you know the story. You know the 300 Spartans, right? Well, I just read it. It's a fantastic book. And what it talks about is the way that Spartans were trained. There was a system. For thousands of years, we've been training soldiers to be a certain way. Right? We've got it down to an art. You just have to trust the system. And it works. It produces soldiers. Orthodoxy is the same way. Orthodoxy is a system. It's not just a belief. It's not just ideas. It's a set of disciplines that are set up to create saints. No kidding. You can take someone who's raw. He doesn't have any spirituality. Come on, who does? And if they follow the system, they will become holy. The fasting, the prayer rule, the repentance, all these things. If we just trust it and really allow ourselves to be molded by it, we're changed. We're changed for the better. And so it's much better than the soldier thing. And I have to give a footnote here. I was a bit disappointed. As a convert, when I was given that prayer book, and I was told about prayer rules, I was told about fasting, I was like, wow, finally a system. Because Methodism, you know why they call them Methodists? Because John and Charles Wesley had a system. They had the book of discipline. They had a way. They said, if you do these things, you will grow in holiness. Is that practiced at all in the Methodist Church? No, only an exception. Okay, so I thought in Orthodoxy, finally, something that treats the entire person. It doesn't treat me as a machine, just giving me ideas, but treats my body too, trains my feelings, and helps me to point my passions. And I was very surprised and disappointed to learn that many Orthodox Christians are not using that system. They are. So we've got these tremendous tools, and we just don't take advantage. So I was under the impression that when I opened my prayer book in the morning and turned to the morning prayers, that I was praying with every Orthodox Christian in the world. I'm not. And that breaks my heart. And it does, by the way, it really does matter if you don't trust the system and you don't live according to it. Let me tell you just a little anecdote. So I was in the reserves in the lead up to 9/11, right? I was in a research unit. Anybody watch MASH? Y'all are probably too young, right? But it's about this military unit, and they're the most unmilitary military people you'll ever see. That was us. All right? And I was a warrant officer, which is the most unmilitary rank in the most unmilitary unit in the whole army. Right? And one of the things that can happen is instead of living according to this warrior system, keeping yourself in shape, shooting, maintaining your proficiency with all your soldier skills, you can just fill out a thing. And I actually heard this question. What do you want on the PT test this year? And then we got deployed. Okay? The first consequence of that was that you had a lot of people who were obviously out of shape, and then when they had their first PT test at a real army unit, they would just have fools up. It was just terrible. But it's a lot more serious when some of us were actually sent over to Afghanistan or sent over to Iraq. Because then it suddenly matters whether you can put your gas mask on in 9 seconds or not. It's not something that you can pencil fake. Because there may be real toxins in you. You may really need to know how to shoot well under pressure. Because you may need to defend the person next to you in a convoy when it gets shot. All of a sudden, the game will change. Well, let me tell you, I've seen enough in my short six years as a priest to know that there comes a time in everyone's life when they're like that. And if they haven't been following the system, then they're out of shape and they don't have the skills. And it's hard. It's hard. And by that, do you know the moment I'm talking about? For some people, it's like troubled marriage or dealing with, death below. But for everyone, at least, it comes at that time struggling with their own death. And it's too late, all of a sudden, to rewind and say, oh man, I should have been fasting. Oh man, I should have been tithing. Oh man, I should have been praying. Whereas the person who has done those things naturally falls into those rhythms. Memorize some songs. There's nothing more comforting. You know what I did in Afghanistan? The first time I went, it was 2003, and things were still pretty, we didn't have a big presence. And so we were in tents, we worked in tents, and we had this compound, because I was an MI guy. And every morning I would go just before sunrise, and I would read the third hour as the sun was coming up on the Hindu Kush, right? And that grounded me. That made it so I could make it through. My faith was able to deliver me through these hard times. One of the things that I saw among the soldiers I served with, especially the second time when the war was going so poorly, was people who had no grounding. They had no foundation. They were fighting a spiritual war, and they were completely unarmed. They didn't know how to pray. They didn't know how to confess. They didn't even know there was such a thing as confession, much less why you would need it. As a result, their lives were just completely trashed. Marriages fell apart. People fell apart. It's not a good way to be. So this Orthodox thing, hopefully you'll never end up in Afghanistan. Hopefully you'll never end up in war. But you are, you've already faced things that are just impossible. And you've overcome them because of the patterns that Orthodoxy gave you. Because you trust in Jesus. All right, that's my pep talk. Say your prayers. Fast. Tithe. Go to confession. So what kind of questions do you have for me? I also do a podcast, by the way. I've got about 150 episodes. About 20 of them are on aliens, right? And prepping, paleo, so pretty much anything.
Is that done? Did you say aliens?
Aliens.
Yeah. Where was it? Aliens or?
Right, yeah, are they real? What does it mean if they're real? Right? What does it mean for Christianity? Does it undermine the whole thing? If they show up tomorrow, does that mean that, Christianity is just a sham? Have you watched any Ancient Aliens? That guy's Greek, right? With the crazy hair? You know what I'm talking about? He's nuts. And his science is terrible. It's just... By the way, these are duels, non-alcoholic.
Where do we find your podcast?
My podcast on iTunes, it's Ortho Analytica. If you search in iTunes for Perkins Orthodox, it'll show up.
Downrange, they don't, I guess I understand they don't typically have
regularly any kind of Orthodox sort of worship, right? Because I think when we talked, or maybe you talked to my son about this, he literally didn't go to church once while he was arranged. And that bothered me. Didn't bother him that much. I prayed, I did my thing. With whom? And but he said there was no son. He goes, actually, frankly, most of the prayer worship was in the various homes evangelical.
Oh yeah.
And he didn't speak to him.
Well, what I did, my first time is I went to the Roman Catholic services. And that's not my thing. But the evangelical services were too happy clapping for me. And one of the colonels I worked with, special forces, no kidding, he was one of the prayer leaders at the Roman Catholic services. So I went there. But the second time, I actually got a blessing from my bishop. The second time I went as a civilian. And both times, it's funny how this works out. So the first time I was a subdeacon. So canonically, I was in kind of shaky territory, right? I was mobilized as a soldier, a warrant officer, to go serve in a war. I was the first one to go from our agency. My intel agency said, we need somebody downrange, we need you to set up an office, to figure out how you can help. And I said, okay. They said, here's your orders. Right? That's it. So I just went to Afghanistan and showed up, here I am, I'm here to help. I didn't have a weapon, I didn't have body armor, none of this stuff that was required in the country. So I was the only soldier in Afghanistan who didn't have a weapon. And the second time I went as a civilian. And as a civilian, I was required to carry a weapon. I was a deacon at that time. So I got a blessing from my bishop while I was there to lead deacon service. So 3 times a week we had Orthodox services in the, what do they call it? Hi, welcome.
Hi, I'm sorry. I thought I said an 8 like all the other ones, but I guess not.
Oh, what?
I'm sorry.
No, you're not. You're fine. Nothing to be sorry for.
I love that class.
That's great.
Good reason.
They had this chapel in, they had the main chapel that was non-denominational, but the Catholics had one off to the side where they kept their gifts. And you walk in there, and yes, they had the Stations of the Cross, but opposite the altar, they had this huge 8-foot, beautiful Greek icon crucifix. Fantastic. I was like, oh, yeah, I'm home. So we would have our top line service during the week. We would have Vespers Saturday evening, and a typical on Sunday, every week. And let me tell you, some miracles happened as a result of that service. I'm still very close to the people that I went through with that. And by miracles, I mean no kidding. People say things that aren't coincidence, stuff happening while I was there. And Colonel Alexander Webster came twice while I was there. Once for Nativity and once for Epiphany. So there in the middle of Afghanistan, you've got, a service with a deacon. Right? It was great. I've got pictures on Facebook if you want to see what it looks like. And he has these camo vestments. Have you ever met Father Alexander? Interesting character. Yes, he's Orthodox. Yeah, he's with the OCA. Romanian. He may be. I think he started the mission. Anyways, so it varies. They do try to get Orthodox chaplains out, but it's tricky. It's tricky. Yeah. How long was I working? Okay. Well, I went to graduate school in Ohio. I'm a slow learner. That was 8 or 9 years until 9/11. And then I was in Virginia for several years. And then Rhode Island. big, and remember, it took a while. Right? So my catechumency was 4 years. It was, parts of it were, there was no jump at all. I mean, the idea, there was this idea in Methodist Church of holiness. Right? So it's not kind of once saved, always saved, binary state, you know. It's this growth in Christ. So that felt very natural to me. The things that I told you there were a couple of things that I just had to take on faith, and one of them was the church. You know, where's the boundary of the church? Right? It's very hard. My mother is one of the most pious Christians I know. My grandmother, I swear, was a saint. They're Methodists. Okay, so are they in the church? This was hard. This was a very difficult thing. And then, yeah, that's really the main one. The others, like saints, you know, there's some, once they explain, you know, do you ask your parents to pray for you? Yes. Your friends to pray for you? Yeah. Do you believe that the saints are still with Christ? Yeah. Why don't you ask for them to pray for you? Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I'll buy that. I did have trouble with some of the hymnography about the Theotokos. To be honest with you, like we say all the time, most holy Theotokos save us. What does that mean? And for a Protestant, it's just wide open for misinterpretation. Because you assume that every Orthodox is going to misunderstand that and think that, you know, salvation is through Christ and His mother. Right? No, that's not what it says. You're going to have to trust the system.
Could you speak a little bit about Eucharist as part of that conversion process?
Yeah, you know, as a Methodist, I didn't have any problem believing that it was the body and blood. You can have a very strong idea of symbol. What does each symbol mean? Well, it can mean all kinds of things. But here was, I told you about one breaking point, was when that seminarian said, you know, oh, the virgin birth. Another one was, when here I am, I've developed this high view of the Eucharist, right? And I'm practicing this high view in the Methodist Church. And then they have laity distributing communion. And I was just like, no, this isn't the way we behave. Right?
But the Catholic Church does that too.
I know, but the Catholic Church, in their defense, is more careful about it than this was. There were issues with this, and the preacher did, the minister did it in part to make a point, and he was trying to drive people like me out. Yeah, I mean, it was very difficult at times because it was a liberal church, and we had my last year there. I was very active in that church. I ran our ministry to the soup kitchen. I was on our board of mission. I was on all the groups, the governmental groups in the church, and in the choir. And the minister knew that I was really good friends with the gays and the lesbians in our congregation, right? Because I sang in the choir. And he wanted to push the issue of homosexuality in the church. And so he said, we're going to have a study committee. And we're going to decide how to best minister to the gays and lesbians in our church. And he said, I'd really like you to be on it. Okay, I'll do this. Well, when I go into a study, I go into it with an open mind, right? I was pretty much the only one that did. And I just couldn't believe, there were two things that bothered me, and honestly, it wasn't the homosexuality. Like I said, I was friends. The problems for me were, one, that we were deciding this issue on our own. Okay? I was like, is this the first time this has come up in Christianity? Church has been around for 2,000 years. I'm sure they talked about it.
On your own as a parish,
Right. Yeah, we were getting decided on that. And so one of the things so that was one of the problems is, this should really be higher. And then second of all, our process was all wrong. We didn't study the fathers. We didn't study monasticism. We didn't study the history of the church. What did we study? We studied psychology, liberal psychology. And we read, people who would explain away St. Paul. Say St. Paul, he wasn't a real Christian. Okay? Now, in Methodism, that's a legitimate, you can make that argument, but it has to be balanced. That's a minority view, and it wasn't presented as a minority view. And it broke my heart when I would say things like, we need to consider tradition. And all of a sudden, all these gay and lesbian friends I had, this minister who had put me in this position told me how disappointed he was. I helped craft at the end of the study, I got together with somebody else and we crafted our decision, our recommendation for the parish. And we worded it in such a way that if you were biblically minded, you wouldn't bolt from the door, but if you were gay or lesbian, you would feel ministered to. And we were like, wow, the Spirit's helping me. And the minister came up and he said, I can't believe you did that. You talk a lot about compromise and all this. Where was God in all that? I was done at that point. That was the third strike. Anything else? You don't want to hear about aliens?
A word you used a few times was trust in different contexts. And it struck me because the first time I recall you used it, you said converts tend to know a lot of stuff because in order to trust it, they have to find out what they can find. Something that I often think a lot about is, what's the future of the church in the West, in the U.S. And I think it's unrealistic to not think that conversion is not going to play an enormous role, if not the primary role in the growth of the church in this way. Later on, you talk about trusting the system. Right? And how when you became Orthodox, you suddenly realized that not everybody who's Orthodox was system. And in fact, I would go a step further and say, so many people who are Orthodox don't know the system they should be trusting at all. So I guess my question is, how do potential converts trust something or come to trust something and find out about something that I think so many Orthodox don't know or trust themselves. And where does the process start? I guess it's a very general macro question.
That's a good question. I like that. Y'all didn't call me on something. I told you there were 3 things I learned from you. I didn't give you the third. Okay, so let me answer this question by telling you this one. I was an interrogator. As a political scientist, I'm a political psychologist. I study manipulation. I study how people take advantage of the way we're wired to manipulate people, to use people. And I learned how to use people myself as an interrogator. That's all it was. It was, it wasn't me. Honestly, they didn't teach any of the stuff that happened over there. They taught you not to do any of that. The best interrogation technique is rapport. Being kind to somebody, they're in shock. Bring them out. Anyway, having studied psychology and sociology and understanding just how unreliable our brains are, and spiritually knowing how sinful I am. St. Paul says, you can be deceived by an angel of light, or St. Paul. You can be deceived by, you can think that the devil's an angel of light. Okay, that's a way of his explaining how unreliable our hearts and our minds are. What does this mean for our approach to religion? What does this mean when, like I did with Orthodoxy, I take everything and decide if it's true? As Americans, we treat religion as a consumer. Which parts of this do I like? We're unreliable. You shouldn't trust your choices. Trust your instincts, Luke. No, don't trust your instincts. They're messed up. You're being used. You're being manipulated. So the question then is, I can no longer be a Protestant, right? Because that relies too much on individual interpretation. Either my own interpretation in soul competency, or the interpretation of my pastor, the Bible study group. They're not reliable. If I know my mind doesn't work, and I've read every book I can find, how in the world am I going to trust anybody else? I can't. But you have to. If you believe in God, you know that He would not leave us as orphans that way. So what did He do? He established the church. You have to find the church, and then you have to trust the church. Does that mean you trust every confessor? No. You still, have to weigh these things, but you trust the system. So that's what I mean. So the question about how are we going to get people to convert to something that we're not practicing, right? Isn't that the question? Well, here's how it worked for me. Once I believed that it was the church, once I believed that it was the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ being offered at least every Sunday, it could have been offered in Klingon, using discordant melodies sung during the liturgy, and offered by someone that I knew was the worst the worst person, and I would have been there because I know that it was true. Because it doesn't depend on the quality of the priest. It doesn't depend on the quality of the music or the language that's being spoken. I think sometimes we do get too wrapped up on language. If we did more in English, we'd attract it. Maybe not. But if somebody believes, it doesn't matter what language it's in. Who cares? I certainly don't. Why am I willing to serve in Ukrainian? Because it speaks to my heart? No, not at all. It is a beautiful language. But I'm serious. If it had gone to the point where the only church was Albania, I spoke Russian at the time, but I don't understand Slavonic. So that's the answer. One of the answers is, and that's the easy answer, right? Presented as the truth, and we're sinners, not worthy of this thing that we've been given. But of course, the other one is that we have to step up. Because here's what's heartbreaking, is when you take somebody who's on fire for Christ, they've discovered Orthodoxy, usually on the internet now, right? They find us on the internet, and they've already read a lot. And then they come in your doors, and they come to class, and you talk to them, and they're like, oh man, that's great. And you say, okay, you need to start coming to church, because the church is the best teacher. And then they walk in, and they see that people aren't taking it seriously. It can ruin the whole enterprise. And that's too bad, because the Orthodox Church is the ark of salvation. And, the Lord is pretty clear. Woe to those who get in the way and cause my little ones to stumble. And if we're not witnessing to the truth by our actions in our parishes, then we are causing people to stumble. We're causing our own children to stumble. Yeah.
Can I ask you to backtrack?
Yeah.
Just a little bit. You said something that kind of stuck in my head, but then you didn't say anything. You spoke about it a little more on the topic psychology.
Yes.
You said living psychology.
Right.
I was just wondering what you meant by that.
Okay, what I meant was we used it with the study group used it with an intention. Instead of going in and say, what is this science? And looking at no kidding experimental results. Okay, what you do is you go in and you find the ones, you cherry pick the ones that give you the results you want. Okay, let me give you an example that came up in this. And this, I don't mind talking about sex, so I'm going to. Okay, so one of the things that became clear, we had a psychologist on the panel. She said, well, why do y'all have a problem with this? I mean, and the topic of masturbation came up. She said, masturbation is perfectly healthy. Okay, how do you define health? It's not spiritually healthy. Okay? I understand it as a bodily function. I get it, you know. But spiritually, it's disastrous. Right? That's why the church teaches against it. So that's what I mean. I mean, so where did she get that fact that it was healthy? It was because she was purely defining it as a bodily function. Right? Right. Yeah, and some of the things, you know, some of our psychology, like I was saying, some of it is fallen. Right? And how can you tell, how do you discern what part is fallen and what part's not? You know, what's going to be your measuring stick? If you're using psychology to figure it out, you don't have a rudder. You're just adrift. Right? And you get it to say whatever you want. And so I just want people to be honest. That's what I want. I mean, I don't know where the conversation on gays and lesbians is going to go. I have no idea. But you can't approach it without looking at church tradition, right? And you always have to recognize that there's a possibility that your feelings are wrong. And that's not what I see. What I see is people are so sure, you know, that, like the people that I was with, they were sure. I mean, these are, you know, committed couples. They care for one another. They've got the love thing down, right? They really did. They weren't willing to sacrifice everything for us. We have to be. There may be something that I really feel is a part of me that I have to give up. And let me talk about the system for a second, because one of the disciplines that really helps with this is silence. Because silence gives you objectivity. We are so affected by our feelings and by our opinions and by all these things that have shaped our minds. We have to be able to let that go. And you can't do it just by saying, okay, I'm going to be objective now. No. What you have to do is you have to learn how to quiet it and to go to that place in your nous, in your heart, that there's nothing. There's no voice. There's a silence. There's an encounter with God. If we can go there, if we can find that silence, when we come back up, we have more objectivity when we see these things. And we say, oh, well, you know, this is not central to my relationship with Christ. What's central to my relationship with Christ is that silence. And it's hard. And you get this, you know, you don't have to talk about gays and lesbians, you get them, right? The fact is that's a small proportion of our population. You know, so many of us, we let our feelings determine our theology. Right? What do I feel is right? And then if the church says that that's wrong, the church must be wrong. Because my feelings are my guide. This is what sociologists call moral therapeutic deism. And what they found is they did a long series of interviews and surveys with, they started when they were teenagers and they continued it as young adults. And they found that no matter what religion they were, whether they were Protestant, Catholic, whatever, I don't know if they had enough Orthodox to affect the sample or not. But they all approached faith in that same way. So you would think, well, central to Christianity is salvation in Christ, right? No. That's not central to the faith of most American Christians, according to these surveys. What's central to their faith is God loves me, okay? God wants me to be happy, and God forgives me. What's missing from it is something that we believe is sinful, repentance. And so it's a problem. When we allow our feelings to determine what is right or wrong in our life, we're on very shaky ground. Yeah?
Individualism.
Oh yeah. American individualism really reinforces it. Because I guess if you were in a culture that respected, Baba, respected, what is it, Yaya, then it wouldn't matter what your feelings said. You'd get straightened out, right? But we don't listen to anybody that actually our gut is really put that.
Yeah, I'm kind of struck. I would imagine that your experience in the military kind of with that kind of depersonalization, that lack of suppression almost. Not like hiding it away, but kind of flattening it out into something that has.
Yeah, yes, it did. You learn to do things. You know, the soldier has to be willing to instinctively jump on the grenade. You know, the person you're sharing a foxhole with, you have to be able to trust that person is not going to run when things get tough. You know, it's the same as in the phalanx, right? You had to know that the person next to you was going to be there with their shield. And so the idea of feelings, you know, this just wasn't really part of the conversation, right? But I don't want to denigrate feelings too much, because the system, the Orthodox system does is it trains the feelings, right? We have an instinct for beauty. We have an instinct of appreciation for beauty, right? God gave us that. Orthodoxy will train it so that it works for our salvation. So I'm not telling you that our feelings don't matter, but they have to be trained. They have to be submitted. Who can you trust? Again, it comes down to a matter of trust. Do you trust your feelings? I don't trust your feelings. I don't trust my feelings. Because if I trust my feelings, then, I've been married for 26 years. Okay. Wonderful woman. I traveled a lot. A lot of opportunities for adultery. No one would have ever known. Okay. Feelings. Not reliable. Yeah, does that make sense to you?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You're not the boss of you, you're a component of who you are.
Right. So the fathers would give us this threefold component, right? The mind, the feelings or the gut, and then the nous, the heart, right? And the idea was you trained the mind and the feelings to serve the enlightened nous, right? That's my spirituality class, in a nutshell. If you could say that, you test out, right? So we have to train our minds and our feelings. And the Orthodox system does that. When you do that through fasting, Orthodoxy is so cool. This is what I'm researching right now. We have an instinct for things that keep us headed in the right direction that non-Orthodox don't. Let me give you an example. Would it bother you if someone, I don't know how to put this. No, let me not put it that way. We have an instinct for the sacred, right? And it's reinforced by the whole way our liturgy is set up, right? We have a sacred place. We're all facing towards it. There's limited access. It's like with the Jews in the high holy place. We have certain things that we touch with reverence. In our tradition, after you take communion, you can kiss the chalice. Whoa! And that means a lot. It's not just a problem. When our building burnt down a year ago, it was heartbreaking to us. And when I talked to my friend who is a Baptist pastor, he's a very serious Christian. He's given his life to Christ. He didn't quite get it, right? For him and his parish, if their building burnt, it's an inconvenience. When ours burns, it's a sacred space to file. Right? When you see the images from places like Kosovo, where you've got altars that have been desecrated, it's not just the ruination of art. It's something blasphemous has been done, right? And so, like with the Pussy Riot thing in Russia, Americans didn't get that. They didn't understand why it was so offensive to have this nonsense going up on the Attleboro. I can be completely supportive of their goals and still be outraged at the way they did. Why is it that we have this sense and others don't? Because the system has worked that into our heart. It's wonderful. Another thing that Orthodoxy builds us an instinct for is deference to authority. This is a hard one for Americans, right? You've got a priest. You know, we've got visitors who come in, little kids, you know, come up. Is that Boji? You know, is that God up there? Is that? No, that's the priest. It's this instinctive deference to authority. Now, my point here is that if we create these instincts, we had better make sure that we don't abuse them. And that's why I manage this site, Good Guys Wear Black, and it's about vocations. And one of the things that I'm posting right now is stuff about why it's so important that priests be, you know, holy men. Because they can completely ruin it. They can take these concepts and abuse them and use them to manipulate people instead of using them to serve them. So we have to be very careful if we're going to create these things. When I talk to other ministers from other faiths in Rhode Island about issues like, you know, like abortion, they don't understand where I'm coming from. Because, or gay marriage. Let's take gay marriage since we've already talked about it and it's controversial and see how many people I can offend. When we're talking about it and they say things like, well, it's not fair. I can agree with that. I can completely validate that it isn't fair. It isn't fair at all. And that bothers me. Fairness is an important value. It's holy. Okay? So I'll validate that, and I come back and I say, but what about tradition? What about the authority of the church, the authority of Scripture? Well then, because they don't have that concept, they don't recognize the validity of the argument. Why don't they recognize the validity of the concept? Because authority has been misused so often in the past. Right? And that's the truth, even by the church. So we had better, but it doesn't mean we get rid of the concept. It's a holy concept. We just have to make sure that we treat it worthily. I mean, I come from the South, and there's a lot of bad things that used to happen there. You know, why? Because powerful concepts were misused. Any more questions?
How do you feel about
Yeah, so the question is, do I think that these other Christian denominations are valid? And I mean, I already told you my grandmother was the saintliest person I know. I think that she would have been even better if she'd been an Orthodox Christian. Okay, so that's the minimalist view of this. The fullness of the faith is in the Orthodox Church. If someone gives their life to Christ and isn't Orthodox, what does that mean? I think it means they give their life to Christ. Right? They're not going to get it quite right? Because they don't have the guides that we do. They don't have the disciplines that we do. But that relationship, I believe is real. I don't think my bishop would be upset by my saying that at all.
You know what?
So, does that make sense? Now, when you go to worship in an evangelical church, it's going to feel more like entertainment. It's not going to feel like worship. It doesn't have that sense of reverence. The centrality of the Eucharist is not there. Why? Because for them it's a commemoration. Do this as often as you will in remembrance of me. Okay, that's what they're doing. They're not participating in the body and blood of Christ the way we are. So it's incomplete. And sometimes dangerous. Sometimes it really is dangerous. Like I think Pentecostal worship can be really dangerous because you're allowing emotion to drive the faith. So are you familiar with Pentecostal worship? A little bit? Yeah. Okay, so the idea is that you're opening yourself to the Holy Spirit, and the fruit of the Spirit is basically chaos, right? I mean, it's everybody dancing, everybody speaking in tongues, and things like this. For us, you know, treasure the Holy Spirit. We invoke him all the time. But, you know, one of the fruits of the Spirit is order. And so the idea that you would turn your relationship with Christ, salvation, over to your feelings like that is just crazy.
So would you say that
I think at the very least it's a distraction. Especially when they say that this is a requirement of you to show that you are a Christian. To show that you have been saved, you have to speak in tongues. That's too much. Do I think that if you open yourself up and you're not trained spiritually, that you can open yourself up to something other than the Holy Spirit? I do believe what the percentage is, but is it as dangerous as a Ouija board? No. But it's not the kind of thing that you want the kids to do, or anybody that you love. Anything else?
Father,
Yeah.
in a simplistic sense, I mean, and a lot of what you said too, I mean, essentially understanding the nature of the fallen humanity. I mean, if you're not radically oriented to Christ, I mean, we don't. I mean, the synergy between your mind, body, soul, it's not well disciplined enough, typically, naturally, to be able to have that sort of spiritual and peripheral vision either. So, like, unless you're radically oriented to Christ, I would say you're radically disoriented. So, I mean, naturally, it's the nature of a fallen humanity to turn selfward, to look for the God within. And I think that a lot of times, like, some of these well-intentioned expressions of Christianity are turning to the God within. And that's where, so your experiences are a manifestation of the God within. That's what's really dangerous. Like people say things like, for example, to contrast that with how we worship, our communal experience of worship, and people say things like, well, it's by rote, it's very expected, or I didn't feel anything. And those are some of the complaints I'll get from people visiting for the first time.
Yeah.
Well, I heard one guy actually said to me, there's almost like elevator music going on up there. Because they weren't engaged in it, right? And so I asked, and I said, what did you notice? And everything he commented on, apart from the elevator music going on back there, was a distraction of everything else around him. And that tells you something. So you mentioned how, you mentioned the icon in Afghanistan, I'm home. It's got to be like completely oriented. And it's so cool because, we begin all our worship by, turning from our disoriented lives to the light of the knowledge of God.
Yeah, I'd follow up with two things.
Yeah, please.
One of them is, this radical orientation in Christ. I love that. The fact of the incarnation. This is one of the things that Orthodoxy really embraces that you don't find so much in Protestantism, is the physicality of worship. Christ was truly man. Why is it that we have all this stuff? Because God's incarnate. And then this just a minor point, I mentioned hesychasm or silence before. Remember that silence without the church is dangerous. It's a heresy. You can't have holiness outside the church. Right? That's what Balaam was against. Balaam. Isn't that the same thing? Anyways, was completely against it because he thought that they were doing it outside the church. You have to have hesychasm in the church, right? That's what I was going to say. It was really wise. So you're just going to know. Anything else?
How do you best way to explain words of silence, prayer of silence,
question is how can you kind of explain or get buy-in on the idea of the need for silence and quiet in prayer, in a worship life? Because so much of Christian experience outside Orthodoxy is happy clapping, right? And emotion driven. Yeah, that's hard. And it's getting harder even for us. I think that the day is already here that it is torture for y'all sometimes to sit in liturgy for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Because we are so used to having our phones. How many times do we check our phones? It's more than once every 2 hours, right? So when we don't have that, and I'm not picking on y'all, I'm the same way. It's hard to have those 2 hours without that dopamine, without those rushes, without checking in on my peeps and all this. And because we are so addicted to this technology, I think it's going to be easier for people to feel the need for silence. Because, we want to be human. We want to be human in a way that's fulfilling. And when we're distracted all the time, we lose that. Right? It is hard for teenagers to have a conversation with someone who's boring. Okay? You know what I mean? It's hard for them to talk to their aunt for more than a minute without looking at their phone. Right? It really is. Because why? Because they're so used to every conversation being around them and completely up to them. And silence, this hesychasm, this idea of prayerful meditation, is a remedy for that, as is liturgical worship. It really is. Yeah.
What's that word you keep using?
Hesychasm? I think it's just Greek for silence. Sorry. Boy. Come on, my kids know that. My kids go to Greek school in Cranston.
So when you're talking about that being inappropriate outside of church, you're talking about like meditation specifically, like transcendental meditation?
No, not transcendental, because transcendental you're seeking a certain kind of experience. And we're not seeking any kind of experience. We're just learning to, the first part of it is learning to ignore all the thoughts that are coming into your head. Okay? And they're called, I'm going to mispronounce it, but logismoi. See, I speak Greek like a southern. Logismoi. So you have all these, they're like, insects flying around your head, all the time. And we have to learn how to just ignore the distractions. And there's a progression to it. I'm a complete beginner. And some Orthodox are unwilling to talk about this discipline. They say, no, this is really meant for monasteries. You need to be under the direction of a spiritual father. Yes, you do. But not to try and quiet your mind for 2 minutes. That's not what the monastics are doing. If you can, as part of your prayer rule, start with 2 minutes. See if you can say the Jesus prayer slowly for 2 minutes without anything else coming into your mind, into your attention. Do you know what I mean? So, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, right? And you say it slowly. And as soon as you do, all these other thoughts about, what you're going to have for breakfast, what is there a message for me, whatever it is going to come. And you can develop the discipline to ignore all that stuff. And it makes us more human. So the reason I don't use words like transcendental is because we're not seeking the kind of experience that transcendental meditation is trying to seek. We're just trying to quiet our mind. And what you find is that basic learning to quiet those thoughts, because we are human, the advice on how to do that is found across cultures and across religions. The thing that Orthodoxy really offers is the knowledge that when you quiet all that, you're not going into nothing. You're allowing yourself to meet Christ in silence. And we don't do this with imagination. We don't imagine, is Christ waiting for me in the throne of my heart or anything like that. Those images are things that we also try to get rid of. And the idea is that as you do that, I said that this was a way to become more objective earlier. Can y'all hear me when I turn my face on? it's a way to make us more objective, so that we're not swayed by our opinions or what we ate last night or anything like that. It also makes us more peaceful. You can draw on the peace that you gain from your prayer during difficult times, right? Because there are certain disciplines that go along with it, things like deep breathing. Deep breathing, it's mechanical. When you do real deep breathing slowly, it changes your physiology. Okay, it reduces stress. It does all these things. When you make that part of your prayer, when you kind of incarnate it, right? Fill it with the Holy Spirit, however you want to say it. During the day, when you're hit with a stressor, you can take a deep breath, fill that with the Holy Spirit, and you've got that kind of reserve. All of a sudden, you're not just reacting to stuff. You're solving things. So
because you go to summer camp, those of us exposed to summer camp, that Bible spot called Alone with God is geared to developing that time of silence, to learn to be quiet. I'm alone with God. You do camp every day. Every morning.
There's a real desire, I think, for that quietness. For instance, I teach at a university, and the Office of Teaching and Learning sponsors these workshops for faculty on this mindfulness meditation, which is essentially, what you're describing, the mechanical process of breathing, the shutting out of the thoughts, as a way for faculty to kind of be better teachers, to focus their attention, and I've often thought, well, how interesting is this that they're sponsoring these workshops? And if I proposed a workshop on where we said the Jesus prayer for 10 minutes, it would never fly. But it shows that there's a desire for this. And so the question is,
because we're human,
right? And so how do we, as Orthodox, kind of tap into that desire and kind of redirect to that, right? To its.
I think if we live it, that's the best way, right? And why not offer classes?
Unorthodox would love it, because they're seeking.
I didn't finish my point either, but Father Kevin did. So when you come up from that silence, you're more objective. Scientifically speaking, you're more objective, but you're also able to focus, and that's so important. The ability to stay on task. This is something we're losing, and I know it myself. When I try to work on my computer, it has been so compromised by Facebook that it's hard for me to write like at 30 minutes at a stretch. It's really difficult, And that's me who am trying to work on this kind of stuff. I can't imagine what it's like to somebody who's doesn't have a prayer life.
There's a wonderful book that I think discusses some of these things. It's Kyriakos Markides, The Mountain of Silence. The Mountain of Silence, Kyriakos Markides. Kyriakos with a K. We have it at most of our church library. You can get it off Amazon.
And his journey has been awesome to follow, because you can follow his work. He's an academic. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Maine.
Yeah,
right? And
he used to be my parishioner.
Really? His early stuff was on just spirituality. So, however he wanted to define it. So he would find faith healers and things like this, and he would just get to know them and learn their spirituality and saw that it was real. And he was out there. His early books were very powerful witnesses to the spiritual life. But he discovered Orthodoxy. So for him, it was going to Mount Athos. Or not Mount Athos. Was it Athos? The guy he interviews in his books, is he from Athos or Thessaloniki? Okay. Just fantastic journey. And his witness is powerful for a lot of reasons. One, early on, he was pretty agnostic when it came to specific.
A monastery in Cyprus. Cyprus.
And once he discovered that authentic, he's Greek. You can tell by the name, right? He's your parishioner. Once he discovered what that was really like, maybe he didn't find that in the parish. I don't know. He fell in love.
The parishes aren't keeping the discipline.
Right. And this is something that's heartbreaking to me, is when we lose a young person to something like Buddhism. Buddhism has some very powerful, it's a powerful system, but it's not Orthodoxy. And Orthodoxy trumps it, right? So we have this wonderful spiritual life, but we also have the theology that saves. And someone can leave our parish, go to college, encounter Buddhism, and think they've found something better. Why? Because they don't know anything about hesychasm. They don't know anything about about fasting, about asceticism, none of this. And that's my fault. But it's your fault too, right? Okay. We're that stoic to the extent that we're not living this life. Yeah, Father.
So, Father, the interesting thing that I've kind of discovered, a recurring theme when looking at various religions, I'm not talking about Christian denominations at all. You look at the expression in various religions who have the tradition of meditation and silence and so on. They're all very common to each other. They may express, practice it differently or have different rules. But again, like it's only the Orthodox practice of meditation and silence, which has that duality of, you mentioned the Jesus prayer. I mean, that's the prayer par excellence of silence, of individual worship, and being with Christ. But it's essentially, it's that, you're God, I'm not. You're God, I'm not. And I'm a sinner. No other religions express that in their meditation. It's just the opposite. They're looking for, again, it's that God within. The goodness within, the light within. They're not looking for the light within. They're looking for the eternal.
There are so many touchstones between us and Eastern religions, right? Because we do believe that the kingdom of God is within us. Right? But how do we get there? Through repentance. Right? By recognizing that I'm not worthy of that. Oh, I'm not trying to unlock the God within. Oh my God, I was born here. Yeah. Oh, but you can understand how that's so attractive. And so what ends up happening is we get Orthodox Christians who graduate, and they graduate with a faith that's never been developed. And so the first time they meet someone who has an adult faith, it really doesn't matter what that faith is. They're really like, wow, this is something real. What I grew up, that's not real. That's just people playing at church, right? And that's not fair, right? Because we're not just playing at church. But I'm sure you've seen that dynamic, right? So, and it doesn't have to be religion, it can be philosophy. Someone goes in and they learn, I don't have to believe in God. This smart person doesn't believe that God exists. And he's got all these wonderful arguments. And then they don't come back and they don't say, Father, my professor told me this, and this. What do we believe? No. They don't ever come back. Period.
Again, it's heartbreaking. That's because we're weak in our youth.
I don't know what it... Well, I do know that we do coddle our... I know this because I'm a parent. I have 4 children. They range in ages from 18 to 2. And we coddle our children. I don't know of anyone who needs to fast more than a 16-year-old man. Am I telling the truth? Y'all remember what it was like? Who else needs to train the passions more? Who else needs to learn to control their feelings more than a teenage woman? Okay, I mean, it's not just men. But we say, oh, don't worry about fasting. Oh, don't worry about confession. Don't worry about any of these things. You can decide to do that when you're older. Well, if they're useful disciplines, our kids need them. Anything else? Still no aliens. I guess maybe is that a southern thing?
Seems off top. Otherwise.
Okay, it would be random. Maybe I can come back. We used to lay down in the side yard and watch for aliens. And because we live next to Hartwell Airport, There were like thousands of them every hour. Always
You
were
didn't
right
have
over my
TV,
house.
so you didn't have TV then?
No.
All set?
Okay, well, y'all have been awesome. I'm on Facebook. You can send me an email.
So you pull in.
Podcast. If you have any questions or anything. I'm Franthony on Facebook. Because I got my account before you could have a father. So it's FR Anthony. FR Anthony. Franthony. All right.
Oh, Rangers, you have Facebook?
I don't go on. My son might communicate.
You just have Instagram, right? He's got a Twitter account.
I have an account, but I don't go on. I only have the accounts I can read the y'all announcements. No, it's. Thank you, Father Anthony. Huh?
Oh, God bless y'all.